significant disabilities has really made a major difference in our entire year's performance. If in fact any of you want more information about our sponsors, and they are the Beacon Group and Focused Wealth Management, you can call into or text the state CP offices, and they will provide that to you. We have one more thank you, and that is to the Evero Group, Evero Corporation. It is due to their continued support in making the Zoom platform possible for us to put this conference on. So we're very appreciative of that. Our first session is History and Hope. And I'm going to introduce the panelists, but for those of you who are part of the CP state, you probably don't need any introduction there. These are our superstars. So I'm going to start with Susan Constantino. Susan is the CEO of State CP, I'm sorry. She will be the moderator and she will be one of the panelists. Next we have Ed, and Ed is head of, I have to read the name, I'm very, very sorry about that. Ed is CEO of Adapt Community Network. I'm just not familiar with all of our new names on a regular basis. Ed Matthew has been around with us for a long, long time and has made major, major contributions and knows so many of you. We also have Natalie Rogers, another one of our board members. And Natalie usually does a great job for us in entertaining in the evenings, along with serving on the board and taking on a lot of our responsibilities. Natalie usually has a song for us, but this year she has something much more interesting for us. So I hope you're going to stay tuned and hear what she has to offer us. And the last panelist would be Peg Gold. That she's not going to be the last who's speaking. Peg is the director of the Training Network Collaborative out of Adapt Community Network and has been involved in a very, very interesting project. So with that, Sue, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ida Jean. Thanks very much, and welcome everyone to our first session. We decided this year that it would be a good idea, based on every craziness that's gone on in 2020, to really talk about years before, and let's think about the future after. And if we can just think of 2020 as an isolated example of everyone's anger at us, then we're okay. We can just move on from there. We actually have, I think, put together an interesting piece for you, because we have from Natalie the real history of CP and how she became involved, which is how lots of folks became involved. And that will give us an idea of, you know, how we were able to bring in so many wonderful community people to help us to get started and to move through. Ed will talk about really how we got involved with getting folks out of our institutions, moving into community living, developing a set of services that is found nowhere else, we believe, in this country, in terms of all of the amazing things we've done. And Ed will talk about that. And I will give you a little bit with Ed, a little bit of a thought about the future and where we might be able to go. But we did want to start with Peg Gould, if we could. Peg, all of us, particularly in New York City, have become such good friends with Peg, because she has done an amazing training program that has been sponsored through Adapt, with training for us to train leaders. And she has taken folks from our agencies and given them some of the most wonderful experiences, and has helped to create for each of us leaders that we are counting on to be there in the future for us. But Peg also became involved with this National Historic Recognition Project. And I don't know where she found the time. I know there were so many calls that many of us couldn't make them all, but Peg was there really looking at who are the people who shaped our field and what have they done, and we can't forget them. So I guess it's really a project to help our field um, stay current with who, how they history. And I think that's what Peg has given us, is a look at all the folks who have really contributed to who we are today so that we can move forward with some confidence. So Peg, I'm going to ask if you would start, because you bring the field kind of view to it before we zero in on CP.
All right, Cheryl, I think you have some slides for me. So let me begin by telling you it was a personal honor to be able to chair this project. The National Historic Recognition Project is part of an ongoing effort that started really in the early 1990s, when we discovered that we really don't have an archive. We have sites, some places where things are kept, but we really haven't retained and there's a story here to tell. So go to the next slide. So the whole concept here was to try to leave a legacy, and that's what the national project was about. Because we don't have an archive, things have gotten lost over time. And stories of who the real leaders were and what they did and the struggles of what they did have also been lost. And so this effort was really to try to take a look at how do we retain that. This particular aspect follows an effort in 1999, which was at the end of the millennial, where we looked back at the 100 years and we recognized 36 major contributions. In that effort, we created a series of essays to kind of tell the story, and we published a commemorative book. We agreed at that point that 100 years was a long time, and that a lot of what happened in the early part of the century, we really didn't capture because we didn't know it. So we agreed that at the 20th year, we'd take a look again. And if a significant amount of change had happened, we would collect and try to collect in a 20-year or 25-year period. Well, this last 20 years has been significant. We've gone from just person-centered to really personalized supports. We've gone from deinstitutionalization to really the development of community-based options, many of them now personalized options. So that was the function, that was the purpose of this. And so it was 20 years, and we decided to redo the project. Go to the next slide. So it really was about creating a historic record. And not only did we go through this national process where we had people nominate folks that they felt had made a contribution, but we also included essays. And those essays were looking at the field from a multiplicity of angles. In fact, Ed was one of the contributors. He wrote one of the essays. The idea again was that these essays would sort of lay out and describe so that that wouldn't be lost to the future. Go to the next slide. The wonderful part of this is all of the national associations participated both in 1999 and again in this 20th anniversary process. We also had local New York State organizations. The Arc of New York had one of the best libraries in the country. When they moved offices, some of those archives have been a challenge for them to protect. ADAPT definitely had historic materials. IAC contributed a major role because they really bring together all the downstate organizations. The Alliance was certainly a part of it. And of course, the State CP Association. in all cases, the idea was that this is a field, we're all in it together. And so it wasn't an ARC archive or CP archive, it was the field's archive. And so it represents a whole array of not only individuals, but groups from across the country, everything from research to practitioners, because all of those are part of that cube, part of what makes us. One of the other things that Ed and I talked about is we wanted to make it a living history, and Susan as well. And so we run this training collaborative, and it's 7 associations in the New York City area. It was a brainchild of Ed's. And we linked one of the emerging leaders with one of the honorees. It was the coolest thing ever. And Susan and Ed can talk about it, but not only did our emerging leaders learn, but the honorees really found that the talent of who's next is and who's on the horizon was vivid. And as a result of it, I think that there was a feeling that that field is going to be in good hands. You know, the old saying, we stand on the shoulders of the people who came before us. The people that came before us hope that that legacy they gave us will be brought forward and hopefully continue to increase the options and opportunities for folks. And I think that what this proved was that that was, in fact, not only alive and well, but without question, we've got the talent coming from. So go to the next slide. So these are the honorees. These are the honorees. I put a star next to everybody who was a New York State person. You can see that New York, as in the first project and in this project, have been the leaders. Truly, New York State has a lot of regulations and a lot of challenges, but it has set the standard moving forward. And that is something I think everybody on this call should be very proud of. The honorees were split into 2 parts, people who did something nationally, and then essential change agents, because without the essential change agents, this would not have happened. We were no longer just court cases and research, we were practitioners. And that change really happened person by person by the work of what happened at the local level. So go back up to the top again. You all said this, and I'm going to leave this to the rest of the panel. But the truth is that today more than ever, knowing our history is important. There's a lot of changes on the horizon. We got to where we got because of Medicaid. The ACA absolutely helped us. And we got where we got because of important court cases. And whether that will continue, that advocacy is going to be the essential ingredient, because that's how we got to where we are, and that's going to become extremely important going forth. And if there's anything out of the National Recognition Project, I think that what we recognized is none of this was easy. So that's it. That's what the project was about, and I hope I summarized it all. And Susan and Ed were both honorees, and yeah, I'll leave this to the rest of the panel.
Thank you, Peg. Thanks very much. And really the amount of time that you put into it was really quite amazing and very, very commendable. I think that the session this afternoon, which is called Crip Camp, which talks about a film that was made about Camp Jened, which is very near and dear to State CP's heart, although this is the old Camp Jened, the one that had closed down near Hunter Mountain before we opened our new one. But I think what it shows us is how, when you talk about who changes what, here we have a group of teenagers who were disabled, who went on to change the world for people with disabilities. And So where change agents come from, they come from everywhere. And what they accomplish can only be thought of as miraculous when you look at who really changed the world for people with disabilities. And it makes you feel, and Natalie, it makes me feel incredibly proud to, number one, to be a part of cerebral palsy associations in terms of the history and what it brought to the field, but also to think about, and again, Camp Jeanette was different when we took it over, but to think about how from our roots came the roots of the disability movement, which again, we'll talk about it another time. But you came into this back in the 50s, the early 50s, I believe. CP of New York State began in 1946 as an advocacy organization, and you came on the board shortly after you got Queens whipped into shape. But I'm wondering if you could just give us a little bit of your history on how you became involved, because your history is yours particular, but follows a lot of how our community folks who weren't necessarily parents of people with disabilities, how we really helped the parents in a way, and then to form these organizations. So if you, Natalie, could give us a little feel about it, and you are on mute right now, so I'll tell you that. Unmute, unmute, unmute. Cheryl, can you help her?
Should be at the bottom of the screen, Natalie. There should be controls at the bottom that say mute near where your video button is. I've asked you to I've clicked on a button that says ask to unmute. So you may have a prompt. Oh, there you
Is
go.
that it?
You got it. You're good.
I'm good.
Yep.
I thought I got lost again. Anyway, Susan, thank you for that very nice introduction. And
I'm just glad to know you wear glasses once in a while.
it's only recent, and don't knock it. It had to happen eventually. You know, I started with this back in 1948.
Wow.
You go to 1950 and so on. And I lived in a community of all young families, women with children. And a notice came around to our neighborhood of a group of women who wanted to get together to form an organization to help children. So I went to the first meeting, and everybody had ideas and talk and so on, that they wanted to do something to help children. We weren't a wealthy group. We were a medium income, medium everything kind of a group. And one woman got up and said, I know what we're going to do. We're going to knit booties. I said, what? I got hysterical. I went out of my mind, knitting booties. So I grabbed one of the other women and I said, look, we don't know what's needed. Why doesn't this other gal and myself form a committee of two and find out what's needed to help children, and then come back and report to you at the next meeting and see what we can do. So I grabbed this gal, I called up the social service director of Queens General Hospital. We lived in the Cunningham Park area of Queens. Queens General Hospital was about a mile or so away, made an appointment, and we talked to her, and I told her the same story. We were a young group of people who didn't have a lot, but wanted to do something to help children. She said, come with me. And she walked us into a room where there were a large number of disabled children. Let me just turn this off. And I took a look at the situation. I'm sorry. Every time I try and turn something off, I do it the wrong way. Anyway, let me finish this thing. Thank you. She took us into a room of children, and I saw cerebral palsy children for the first time in my life. And I took one look at that, and I was hooked. They were severely disabled children. And she said, you know, these children are the most disabled we know, and we don't know how. Turn off.
I tried that.
Okay. She said, we don't know what to do with them. She said, we just don't know how to handle them. And I was hooked. I took one look at these kids and I came back and I said, these are children who need help. We can't do much about physically helping them, but we can help raise some money to get some professional people who would know what to do, who may know what to do. And that started Cunningham Women's League, which became the first of about 12 different fundraising leagues all throughout Queens County in different areas of Queens. Simultaneously with that, while we were forming a fundraising group to raise money, I got involved through a series of associations that I won't go into, with parents and people representing parents of cerebral palsy children who were just trying to form a Queens County organization to help CP children. There was already a state association, nothing in Queens. Nassau and state were forming already, and Queens had just a handful of people. And I got involved and I said, maybe I can help. And I got into it up to my eyeballs. I got, well, when I do something, unfortunately, I try and do it to the best of my ability, as much as I can. And that's what I was doing. And I got an assembly person, an assemblyman, and a state senator. I got judges. I got builders. I got bank people. I talked to everybody in the Western world that I could find who would listen to me. And I began to get together a group of people. Oh, for Christ's sake.
He is the most popular person that we know.
Oh, this is ridiculous. Whatever it is. I thought it was, my birthday was 2 days ago. It was 101 and the phone was ringing. I figured by today, everybody would leave me alone and it would be fine. Anyway, I did get a whole bunch of people together. And little by little, we began to get some professional people in, started with children, center personnel, started with, then it became vocational center people. Dan Weeder was our best executive director with a great vocational background. And we began to do things. And I'll tell you just one other story. And that was a guy named Mac Markowitz from Nassau County. Nassau had done some incredibly wonderful things. And I said to him one day, Mac, how do you get started with this? There's so much to do. How do you do it? How do you get started? And he said to me, have you an idea of what you want to do? I said, I think so. He said, do you think it can be done? I said, I think so. He said, well, girl, just do it. Do it. That was it. So we did. We got land. We built the first children's center. We filled the place up and we had no room for vocational, for adults. And then we started building our second center, which was our adult vocational training center. And Queens grew. I got involved with the state association. I got involved with the National Association at that point. And it took over a great deal of my life. And I have never regretted one single second of it, ever.
Well, Natalie, we've never regretted one single second of it either, because what you've contributed to the field is so immense. And I believe that, a lot of people think that, women should knit booties, and we know that that's not the case. We know that there are so many.
That's what did
Yeah,
it.
exactly. There are so many things that you were able to accomplish, and we see that throughout the state. I remember being at a dinner at our affiliate out in the Finger Lakes and having a father tell a story about how his daughter, when she was born with cerebral palsy, and that she was told that they were told, the family, that they should just put her in an institution, one of the state schools. And it was the thought at the time, that was what was going on. And the father knew that that wasn't what they wanted to do, but they didn't know what else to do. And they put together a group of families, much like how I've always heard the story about the advertising in the newspaper about, I'm a parent of a child with cerebral palsy. Does anybody else have that problem? So that families could get together. But what was most inspiring to me was that they said, and then we called this organization, State CP, and they sent us Frank Keating. And many of you may remember Frank Keating, who worked
Sure.
with us as a lawyer. They sent us Frank Keating, and he showed us how to get started. And I thought, wow, you know, this is probably into the later 50s or maybe 60s. I'm not sure exactly when the Finger Lakes started, but you start to look at how the network of what was created allowed a lot of this to, it allowed all of this to happen. And we started different than a lot of other organizations. We started where the state association really, its function was to help others create independent corporations, which allowed them to do what they did. And our main role, or one of our main roles, was certainly to advocate to the state for services, because, you know, none of this can happen unless you have money. People can fundraise, and certainly there are schools and different pieces that have started through fundraising. But for the cost of the care and the cost of what we need to do to support people, we needed government funding. And for sure, that's a piece.
At the beginning, it was only the money that we were able to raise.
Exactly.
No government fundraising.
Exactly. And the number, and think about what you just said about building buildings and whatever. I mean, the amount of fundraising that still goes on is incredible, but without the ongoing government support, there is just no way you can do it. And when I think about the earlier days, and I was in education, and it started in a public school, and it's funny, I was thinking about it, that in the public schools, they had education. They didn't have to. In 1976, when we finally got the Handicapped Children's Act and was able to start school, that it was now required. But I was in Buffalo at the time, and it was like the schools were numbered. So school 24 was for kids who were very significantly cognitively impaired. School 11 was for kids who were deaf and hard of hearing. School 84 was for kids with cerebral palsy or other physical disabilities. So it's like we were all still grouped together, and they were, you know, they gave you whatever services they thought. And the notion that people were also told, that physicians were told, you need to place your child in an institution, was because there were no other places. There were no other spots, not the kind of homes like we have today. We got here through a lot of hard work and finally getting our state to listen to us. And one of the things that I would ask Ed Matthews to talk with us about, because he worked for the state at the time that they were looking at how to deinstitutionalize, and starting with Willowbrook, which has become our symbol of don't ever take us back there because of what Willowbrook was. But throughout the state, there were, and Ed can probably fill us in on the number of institutions, and they weren't all as bad as Willowbrook, but they were institutions, and what it took to get us to, in fact, then be in a different world, and in a much different world than where we were then. So Ed, I'm going to send it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Susan. Yeah, Natalie goes back to the 1950s, and in the 1950s, you were just getting started with both education and services for adults. It was really World War II, I guess, that started the whole idea about rehabilitation, and for returning soldiers with missing limbs and who needed rehabilitation. So they created these workshops. And, you know, the advocates at the time basically said, me too, you know, and so you started getting, you know, training centers for, you know, basically that time, mildly impaired, I guess, adults with developmental disabilities, CP, they were mentally retarded, of course. And in education, you had the Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, which was really the first effort at racial equality, but really the advocates at the time said, well, we count too. And so public schools started to have to accept kids with disabilities, and of course you had the educable, trainable, and the not so good. So that was pretty much what you had at the time. Yeah, Willowbrook changed everything. Not much change between the 50s, and there were different laws and civil rights and so forth. But from a service delivery standpoint, it was the 1960s. The government decided that the whole European hostel program was something that they could reinstitute here. So the larger agencies, the CP centers, and mostly the ARCs, and some of the religious groups, quite frankly, both Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish, particularly, created hostels. That's the original name of, what do you want to call it? ICF, an IRA, a group home, a CR, whatever you want to call hostels. There was 1 through 100, and they had the Department of Mental Hygiene had a whole unit that would help create these things, and there were people handing out, and DD had 2 people working in it. One of whom was Nick Constantino, who was handing out DD grants, developmental disabilities grants. It was all out of the Department of Mental Hygiene. And downstate was a man by the name of Bob Sansone, who became the executive director of Suffolk ARC for a long period of time. But they were the only people really who were handing out any kinds of contracts or grants for programs. Everything else was done by local governments, county and city governments. The only statewide things were these sort of DD grants. And so it pumped and bumped along for a number of years until Willowbrook changed everything, because there were 20 developmental centers at the time. And remember, the Willowbrook court suit was interesting because it never asked, first of all, the number of parents who were, they interviewed hundreds of parents and talked about the conditions there. But you've seen all the stories and the newsreels and all of that stuff, so I won't go into that. But ultimately, when they decided to make this a civil rights legal action, none of the parents wanted to sign the petition because they were afraid of retaliation. So they got a New York City congressman by the name of Ed Koch to sign the petition, because he later became mayor, and anybody who's ever met the guy, he was afraid of nothing. He didn't care about anything. So he had the same personality as some modern politicians, but different political focus. So he signed the petition. And the petition was never to deinstitutionalize the developmental centers. The petition wanted to improve conditions. They wanted bars of soap. They wanted clean bathrooms. They wanted bedrooms. They wanted things like sheets on the bed. If you read the original petition, that's what it calls for. And the suit was filed, and the original judge, whose name was Orrin Judd, told them that he could not order he had no authority to order the closure of the institution, in case anybody was wondering. And the ACLU, which was basically representing the plaintiffs with Chris Hansen, they were sort of surprised by this. But he said, because in the back of their minds, although the petition itself was for better conditions, in the backs of the minds of the activists, they were looking for closure. And he pretty much said he couldn't do it. He passed away, and the next judge, by the name of John Bartels, became the ultimate judge who issued the orders. But the state came in after the trial lasted about 3 years, off and on, 2 years anyway. And the Department of Mental Hygiene came in and said, we can't do it. We know we should do it, but we cannot improve conditions in the institution. And there's, a lot of reasons for it. There was staffing issues. There was this issue. There were, the union issues and this, that, and the other thing. And they just never felt they could do it. They never felt they could comply with an order that they knew was going to come down. They never thought they could do it. They said, we're going to close it. And I'm telling you, people came out of their chairs. I mean, the plaintiffs' attorneys, sat frozen in their seats. I mean, literally. I mean, nobody saw this coming a mile away. They said not only were they going to close Willowbrook, they were going to close every single developmental center, 20 of them throughout the state, in some closure plan that they put together, which of course, as you might imagine, they never met the timetables, but they never swayed from it. The governor at the time was Hugh Carey, and he was actually his office that recognized that they were going to be behind the 8 ball for this for 100 years unless they tried to do something different. So they decided to close it, and they and they also recognized that a state department, which was run essentially by psychiatrists, the Department of Mental Hygiene. Now, if you look at modern history, this is pretty funny, right? So they felt that, and I'll try to be as straight about this as I can without wandering into 2020. They felt that a state agency run by doctors couldn't do anything for developmentally disabled people. I swear to God. So anyway, that is absolutely true. So they hired two of the young people that they hired who were working in the governor's office. A man by the name of Jim and a man by the name of Clarence Sundrum actually wrote the entire docket, which became the state law, which separated the department into three separate offices. The Office of Mental Health, what is now OPWDD, which, by the way, just interesting from a social standpoint. When they created OMRDD, they knew that the term mental retardation was a pejorative one. This goes back to mid 1970s. They knew it was a problem. They knew it was going to be a lightning rod for criticism, because even at the time, advocates and families never liked the term. Right? It was associated with people who were different. It was associated with institutionalization. It was associated with all this other stuff, and it was really, and they knew it. They wanted to call it the DDSO. They wanted to call it the Developmental Disability Service Office. That was what was in the original law, and
Wow.
that they passed. Yeah, that's true. And it was actually the Arc of New York, a man by the name of Jerry Weingold, who was a parent and a lawyer, and probably the most politically savvy politician of the time, of people in the field. We had our own at CP, but he was probably the loudest voice, and anybody who knew him knew that was true. Absolutely refused. He actually went to Senator Conklin and all these others who were the legislators who were sympathetic to this cause, and said that unless we kept the term mental retardation in, nobody's going to know what we're talking about, and nobody's going to give us any money, and the people are still going to be left behind. And his argument won out for, I don't know, when to become OMRDD. Want to become OPW. So his argument went out for, I don't know, 30, 40 years. But yeah, what interesting enough, they knew it at the time. So they created this separate office, and they created various units throughout the state to implement the judgments, because they had to close 20 developmental centers. And all of the things that we think about now in terms of independent living and family care, and they actually tried them. They actually thought that the whole idea of just moving people into less restrictive environments in terms of just group homes was not anything that they wanted to do. First of all, the cost of it, number one. Number two, they really felt that they could get churches, communities, and everything else to really take people in family care. But they bumped up against a number of social issues, including, for instance, in the city of New York, you had all of these home care issues, you had family care issues, people had to have separate bedrooms, and this and that and the other thing. And most of the class members in the Willowbrook class came from the city of New York. So, they bumped up against all of these problems, including the fact who in New York City has a separate bedroom for everybody. So they couldn't do it, even though they had some groundswell of support from the community and a lot of the child care agencies. They just couldn't do it. So they created residential programs. That was the way in which you were going to get thousands of people out of the institution. And to them, and to us at the time, rather, smaller was 20, 25 people, And so in the city, we took over every religious building we could find, every convent, rectory, and other congregate living for nuns, priests, or anybody else you could find is now a residence in the city of New York. And the church made millions off it. But the interesting part about the judgment was there were no rules until 2 or 3 years later, when we necessarily had to get federal dollars in, and therefore took the nursing home regulations and sort of just jury rigged them up to get the ICF regulations. Pardon me. You really didn't have that many rules, and with the ICFs came rules. But at the time, you had the greatest thing was when you worked for the state, which was why all of us who worked for the state at the time have fond memories of it. Which I try to remember. I try to tell people, you should have been here when you could actually do something. If you had a good idea, you can implement it. flip side, if you had a bad idea, you could implement it. And so there were plenty of both. But at the same time, a whole system of community-based services were created for thousands and thousands of people. The 1980s brought different, by that time, the national movement was for smaller programs. There were a number of advocates saying, look, you don't need all these ICFs. You don't need all of this stuff. You don't need all of these things. And the home and community-based waiver came into being in 1982. And New York, which was spending so much money on these congregate settings, it took us a good 10 years later to create the waiver. And honestly, I'll leave to historians what we did with that. Most states used it to jumpstart the institutionalization in the 1980s. So they created more independent settings, more this, more that. They didn't have the numbers of people, so lots of different things happened. But we continued to create the types of environments that we had. We called them different things. Day treatment became day hab, ICFs became IRAs, and other things happened. So there were a few innovative things around the country, but honestly, around the state. But honestly, if you look back on it, I think we missed an opportunity then to really reform the system in ways that we're probably paying the price for now, as a matter of fact. So although there's a lot of things in government that I think they deserve a lot of blame for, at the same time, I think we as an industry also didn't use that opportunity. There's some people tried. I mean, they had these ops programs and you had this and you had that, but ultimately those things also became, in many cases, some people did very innovative things with them and some people did more of the same with them for more money. So it was, there was a mixed bag of things. And government itself never set a pace of new design and new innovative things. They also were marching to the same drummer that we were a long time ago. But ultimately what happens is that, the money runs out, the money to create these types of environments. Once the lack of recognition on everybody's parts, once the court suits were over, once the developmental centers were closed by and large, once everybody was living in the community, we all still thought that what we should do is continue along the same vein. There'll be more group homes, there'll be more this, there'll be more that. And government had lost the impetus to create all of those things. And we didn't necessarily, as an industry, recognize that and push for reforms ourselves until now. Right now, of course, we're forced into that. No matter what you think of whether it's managed care, this, that, the other thing, we'll cycle back to that. But ultimately, that's how we sort of got to where we got to. And you're standing on the precipice now of another sea change. And what we do with it is up to us by and large. So, but that's how we sort of got to where we were. Government was fun. We had a lot of money in the system. And, there were things, I think, in retrospect, things we did extremely well and things I think we had to do all over again, just like any other thing, any other historical project, things I think, well, we might have done that a little bit differently, be better off now. But at the same time, that's how we sort of gone from the 1950s to at least this century anyway.
Well, thanks, Ed. And I think that while Willowbrook and all was downstate and looked at New York City, I think that upstate, while they didn't have a Willowbrook, they had the same impetus to do this. And what they had upstate, which was just different, is they had more space and more room. And so people lived in homes, and you remember the 12-bed home was like the kind of the model, I also remember in New York City thinking that when we opened up, and I believe, Natalie, it was called the 90 Eaton Center, I think that was a 65-bed home in the Bronx. And the truth is that 65 beds was a lot less than 1,000. And so it looked like it was a smaller place for people to live. Ultimately, we took it down and we built 3 8-bed homes on the same site, and the rest of the folks all had moved to other places. But again, as we look at how we do these things, there's a size issue, but there's also a money issue. And in New York City, one of the things we all had to do as providers there, we had apartments. So we might have 4 people. We were like leaders in the 4 people in an apartment, whereas upstate the numbers were larger. But our 4 was only because that's how the size of apartments were in New York City. And you could put in a 2-bedroom apartment, you could put 4 people. unless it was a particularly big apartment and the state would ask you to come and put a fifth person in. And
Yeah,
so
what happened with that, Sue, is that at the time, Jim and Trone had become the commissioner and had left, and Arthur Webb became the commissioner. And, you still had all of the multiply disabled folks living, because everybody was cherry picking people that they wanted in these group homes and the class members. So they still had people with multiple disabilities living in Willowbrook. And so they went to Bob Schoenhorn, who was the executive director of United Cerebral Palsy of New York State at the time. First, they went to the New York City chapter, mine, and asked us to enter into a special contract to do that, which my predecessors refused. Again, decisions made at the time affect you, and so they went to you guys, and at the time you took over 2 buildings in Willowbrook back in the late 70s, and whether you do that again or not, I don't know, but
I'm not
that
sure.
brought us. Well, you brought your own staff, and into a situation where the CSEA was being replaced by voluntary agency staff. Good luck with that. But at the same time, to move people out, you got these special contracts because we didn't have all these rates and stuff. So you got these special contracts to create these community-based enclaves. It was called the PIP contracts. It was called the Post-Institutional Placement Program, and that's how they created all of these apartments. And as a parenthetically, because the Public Service Commission would allow these group homes to have residential rates, but you had to have a name for to go on it. So nobody wanted the name on it. So you had all these names like Bob Pip, Cora Pip, this Pip, that Pip in the phone book for the residences. But that's sort of how you got started doing all of the residential stuff in New York City and beyond.
Well, that's exactly right. And because again, because we were a United Cerebral Palsy Association affiliate, meaning the national organization, usually only one ran in each particular area. So WCP had to get a special, have a special agreement between New York City, UCP, and ourselves because of that. And we took about 600 people out of Willowbrook.
So there was a 3-part agreement between the city chapter, you guys, and national.
Right. And it's interesting to think about, because I'm not sure if you think about trying to staff up for 600 people and trying to get ready for all of that. We had we were supposed to be just an advocacy organization. We had no real experience. But I think what happened is that there was such a great need to want to just bring people out, and families were so involved with that. The folks, though, that we took out of Willowbrook didn't have a lot of families. We really didn't have that kind of family push that all the other agencies had. And it's taken us a long time. If that was in the late 70s, it's taken us a long time to really get to a spot where we now have more families involved. But our history, again, if we look at our history, we learn from it and move forward. And it took us up to almost where we are today. But the driving force of all of it, and if you think back, Natalie talked about raising money, and Ed talked about government money that was there. The driving force of anything that we do is unfortunately money. And obviously, as we've said to everyone, our first and foremost goal is trying to create lives for people with disabilities, help them create their own lives, or to create lives for them and their families. But the truth is, if you don't have money, you're not going to be able to do it. And this particular part of our story going forward is that while New York State was always the leader, and New York State was willing to put a lot of money into it, and one of the gentlemen who's on our board of directors right now, Bob Norris, when he worked for the state, was able to show how to use Medicaid money to do it and to bring in the federal dollars. And that's always a good thing if you can get matched with federal dollars. So that money would flow. And then we had a commissioner, Tom Mall, who knew how to do the money in a way that brought significant dollars to us simply as they started, because he wanted to bring significant dollars into the state. And the agencies were able to benefit from that. So we had a number of years of lots of money, lots of development, But like Ed said, and I think it is it, when you have the money, you develop more of what you've got instead of looking at, are there other ways to look at this? Are there other things that would be better? Should we be looking at different ways? Or should we be looking at what states that don't have money are doing, because they're coming up with some creative ideas on how to do some things that will help families and individuals get integrated into the community without it necessarily being a 4-bed or a 6-bed or an 8-bed or whatever the number of bed home is where people will live. And it's taken us a long time to begin to really look at how we need to do things differently. And I think that as we're thinking about our future, again, we need to go back and look at that. I wrote a couple things down as people were talking, not because it makes any sense right now, but I do have to tell you, if you do get to see the movie Crip Camp, and again, we'll talk a little bit about it later this afternoon, but if you get to see that, when Ed talked about the veterans coming back, what the people from Crip Camp talk about, and these were the people with disabilities, and what they talked about was the hierarchy of disability. And if you had, and now another thing that was going on in our country at the time in the 50s and whatever, was polio. The 50s and 60s was polio, and polio created a number of children who then had physical disabilities afterwards. So these young people at Camp Jened would talk about the hierarchy of people with disabilities, and at the very top were those that had polio. They were the top of the hierarchy, and for them, school, they may not have been able to get in because of their physical disability, but certainly not because of their cognitive disability. And they may have been in the basement or in a place where they could get in, but they were able to fare better through it. The bottom of the rank was those individuals with CP. And because their disability created multiple other things. Some of them may have been cognitively involved, but not necessarily, but their language may have been involved with their disability. So many of them, their ability to move. And that created then for us as United Cerebral Palsy, the real notion of what do we do? How do we support those individuals? We know right now, if we get up to this day, most of our agencies have changed their names because they don't support just people with cerebral palsy. Most of our agencies now probably don't even have 50-50 in terms of that, because luckily people with cerebral palsy are being served in the schools. They are out to do a number of different things. Their disability isn't their life anymore. But so we see the change. We see the change that people with disabilities have brought about themselves, what they've really pushed for, and the change their families have brought about. And now we're at like a precipice. We don't have money anymore. Our field does not have the dollars that it takes to be able to support people. We particularly need to look at people who have the most significant disabilities and how do we support their families and themselves, because they are the folks who really have been left out of a lot of the service system except for our residential programs. And there is currently a push today to not rely on residential programs. If you think about it, the promise that Mario Cuomo made to families was you will never have to worry. You will always have a residential program. But that's not true today. That is not true today. You may not. And based on your ability, you may have something much better, even though your family may not at first see that, but you may have something that's significantly different. But it puts on agencies like us, on providers, really a creative mindset that we don't always have, an ability to think creatively about how to pay for things, and we don't always know, and an ability to look at what is our role. It's difficult when you've spent your whole career building. I'm building my residential program. I'm building my program for people. And now we're forced with a point where we're saying, I'm closing homes. I'm doing something different because we can no longer afford those homes and they may no longer be the right way to do it. And I
It was,
think it,
it was all we knew. I mean, because of the number of people you had to place, New York, if you go to any other state, they don't have the level of congregate setting that we did. And they didn't have the number of people either, but it was all we knew. It was the only model we created. And
Yep.
that's what I think some of the tyranny of the waiver was, is that we still created the same model. And, you know, and there was a mystique to it. You know, there's part of, you remember the term continuum of services. So you had continuum of services. It was where somebody got out and they went on their own and they lived with their friends. Well, the only friends they knew were the staff and the forced relationship in the house. So it wasn't, you know, we look at that now and say, well, why did we do that? Because it's what we knew. But now we know better. In addition to the money not being there, we have other ways of looking at it that we know better. But that was all we knew. So that's what parents say. Well, that's what people do here, but it's not necessarily what.
But Ed, you have to understand, and you do, the government encouraged us to build residences.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Originally, we had day services for children and for adults and all kinds of wonderful day services. And they said to us, come on, get into residential. And they encouraged us to go for the most expensive and the most difficult service that we're now struggling with.
It's what made you necessary. Government needed to deinstitutionalize. So residential programs is what, if you didn't do it, it was, the day services were nice and the other things were nice and family support was nice, but unless you were doing residential services, you weren't necessary to the government's, you know, need to deinstitutionalize
And
and to get people out.
wanted
That's
us
right.
to do it.
That's yes, oh, absolutely.
I just want to add one more element, and that's that we got to where we got also because of family members and self-advocates advocating for it. And one of the things that we're almost victims of our own success in the sense that people are content and there are options. And now when you're going up saying it's not, look at how horrible Willowbrook is. And so people could see that had to end. But now you've got residences and people do have quality of life. And some families are not as motivated because, like you said earlier, you know, I'm not sure I want to cause too much havoc because my child is okay and we're pretty content. That's
Right.
an important element in terms of where we are.
that's right, safety. There's a safety element in it. And what I think our agencies have provided for families is safety and peace of mind. We know that if I have my son or daughter living in a home, in a residence that is a good residence and it's working well, I have peace of mind that their life is going on and that's a good piece to it. And we know that, you know, again, our field has gone through in the last probably 4 or 6 years, you know, a real staff shortage feeling too, so that when you look at your residential programs or any of the day programs or whatever, the shortage of staff have made us be more creative. They certainly have made us look differently at how we're operating. And now we need to really begin to focus on not only how are we going to really not, you don't want to take apart the residential system because there's always people who are going to need to have a congregate living arrangement. And if that can be smaller versus not nursing homes, it can be something smaller and more personal and where they've lived. And I don't think that the state, even in its infinite wisdom, would ever think that that was something that they wanted to do away with at all, obviously. But we need to think about
downsizing.
But downsizing, exactly, Natalie. How do we look at this and how do we pay for it? Every other, in our state currently right now, every other area except for ours, so individuals who are in mental health programs, individuals who are in any kind of health issue, anything as it relates to being paid for by Medicaid is in a managed care system. And it's only in our field right now, currently, that we are not yet in managed care. We have had fits and starts. We know that you've all heard the word DISCO, which I can't even tell you what it stood for anymore, but it really had to do with beginning managed care. And we have gone through the CCOs, the coordinated care organizations, which were set up about 2.5 years ago, so that we could get ready for managed care and that they could help to develop these managed care, provider-led managed care systems. And now we're in a state where, or in this state of mind about, is it managed care by providers, so provider-led? Is it managed care by big managed care organizations? Or is it managed care by the government and having the government do this? So we've got these things going on that are going to in fact shape where we go, and money will always play a huge part of it. With that, if you're having a managed care company help to determine whether you need a residential program or whether you need to live independently in the community, or whether what you need is what you're going to get, will again have a large effect on where we're going to go. So I guess, and Ed, and I'm just going to throw it to you for a minute, because I know that you really are a proponent of managed care, because it seems like the next logical step to help us to be able to move into a new funding source and an ability to help support people. So I'd ask you to just talk about it for a minute.
Yeah, I remember something that as we look at as we are right where we are right now, we have a tendency to be a little forlorn about it. I certainly do. And I know Susan from time to time gets a little dejected about it, and certainly Mike and everybody who I don't see out there the same way. But look, I mean, and you can look at our own political situation in the country as to where we are right now. I mean, regardless of how you feel about the president or the vice president or any of these other people that are, that are running government, or the people running for office, or Biden or any of these people, it doesn't matter. You could say this is the worst time or the best time ever, but the fact of the matter remains is that it'll still be there. 10 years from now, 20 years from now, the buildings that they built in Washington in the 1800s, they're still there. I mean, all these government agencies are still there. So it'll survive. And so the people here, there's 150,000 people that are going to get service somewhere, somehow. They're not all going to go back to Willowbrook. I mean, we talk about it in the most political sense, because we want to get people's attention. And Willowbrook, the name Willowbrook gets, legislators and other people's attention. It's none of us believe that we're creating, 6,000 bed institutions again. But so something will happen, and I think no matter what you call it, managed care is a payment vehicle. It's not a service vehicle. We're going to provide services out there. We're going to provide services out there for every single person who needs them. It'll be different than it was 40 years ago, but it's different now. So, that part's not going to change, and there'll be voluntary agencies, and maybe fewer, maybe some more, maybe smaller, maybe bigger, but we're going to provide the service out there. We're going to do everything we can to make sure that people have meaningful and independent lives as much as we can, as much as they can. Sometimes money will be good, sometimes it'll be bad. Sometimes we'll raise good money, sometimes we'll be part of the, movements have lifespans. So when in fortunately we came in the 1970s and 60s when, community activism and social activism was at its height. Well, it's going to be, we'll be big again, but, it was, so the fact we all came into this when, people were living in institutions, they're living in squalor, they're living in this. So we had, movements have a certain lifespan. So this is a mature industry now. We have to behave like a mature. We can't behave the same way as we did when we were creating it. And I think sometimes we fall into that trap, like we're still creating something. Well, we're not. We're a mature industry. We're retooling things so that people can become more independent. They can live more independently. They have sociability with people who are not staff and the other people they live with. And they have jobs and they have meaningful lives. And so we have to retool all of that, but we're not creating, that's out there. We have to figure out how we use the tools that we have to do things better. So whether you're talking about managed care is a payment vehicle. And the question is, my firm belief is that we're better off, at this point, in any level of discourse, is that we're better off depending on each other than we are on government appointed officials. That's not just this one, it's any of them. And I think we've reached the maturity of the industry now where the best minds are here. There was a time in the 70s where we had loads of best minds in government. We had all the consultants that that they were consulting with all the people that Peg mentioned in the historical project, consulted
Right.
with governments all around the country. Well, they're not there now, they're out here. So I think we can create the money, we can do things that are efficient, and we can do things that are better for people. You know, the government people don't like to hear that because, you know, what the hell, they got jobs to do. And they don't, I said this to one of them recently, that everybody in OPW, every time they hear about somebody needs something, they think of the agency the single agency that they think is ripping them off. And they think that's who they big in their mind. You know, those people, they're not doing anything out there. So that dynamic is dysfunctional. You know, it's not about whether this guy's the commissioner. The dynamic itself has become completely dysfunctional. And I think we have to take control of it. And we will. Whether we do it through the commercial managed care, we do it ourselves, I think, or how that ever works. I think it's paying for service, head on the bed, ass in the seat, and all the rest of the stuff. All of that is yesterday's news. I think if we really want to do things with people, then we have to be left to our devices to create those environments that we think work best for people. And we should be judged on whether we did that or not whether somebody showed up that day or not. So I think those kinds of...
Ed, do you feel it is more of a challenge now than it was early on when we were building and creating and starting all of the new programs?
No, because we know the people now. You know, honestly, I think we know what we're doing, and I think we know what people need now. Remember, when we were taking people, we have no idea who they were. I mean, we were creating stuff for people we didn't really know. We know the people. There isn't a person now that receiving the support that we can't talk about individually. We know them, and we know what they need. We know what their mobility problems are. We know what their physical problems are. We know what their health problems are.
So you feel the transition is very doable?
Absolutely, absolutely. But I think it takes will, and I think it takes us all working on the same side of the street, regardless of how there's some nuance of difference. But I think we have to be on the same side of the street in order to pull the wagon. Because other than that, you know, Ben Franklin was right. Either we all hang together, we're going to hang separately.
That's right. And I think that the other thing, Natalie, that has shown providers how much they really do know and how really competent they are is unfortunately COVID. I think that when we first last March, all of a sudden came into this new world, we knew what needed to be done, and we told government, we really knew this is when you need to close programs. This is how we need to keep people safe. This is how we need to stop this. This is what we need to do. And I think that should give any provider the confidence that they really are able to make some of those type of decisions. The people who we support, now they're much more able to make a lot of their decisions, and they want to live different kinds of lives. And those that need us for most of their life, that's all right. That's what we'll be there for. But there are so many people who are telling us clearly, I want a different life. I want to do this. I want to live only with this guy. I have a job. I want these pieces. I think the providers need to listen, and I think government needs to listen to the fact that the providers, you've given us over all these years, you've given us, you know, all the rules and all the regulations, because as Ed said, somehow, because one guy didn't operate right, you think no one does. We do. And so I guess managed care, or how we're going to fund our programs, will be our next step, not because it helps us to provide what folks need, but because it helps us to provide better, helping them what it is and giving them opportunities. So I
think it's integrated. You know, you're gonna be providing that across all systems, healthcare, and the regular list of Medicaid services that we don't really touch in terms of personal care and home care and all the equipment and all the rest of the stuff in the menu of services. Those are things now that'll be under, and I use the word control in the most advisable sense, that are under our purview, under our control, and be able to work with the actual healthcare provider and integrating all of that care. It's got to be better outcomes for people. It just has to. It's a bifurcated system now, regardless of how we do it, no matter what you call it. When we integrate every part of the person's life and we work on that, people got to have better outcomes. They're just going to.
I think that's absolutely right. Is there any, Mike, I don't know about any questions or anything that would have come in through the chat room, but we want to end with Natalie's poem. But before we get there, are there any things that we need to address at all that you could see?
No, I think what you guys just said there, and I know it was going to be a challenge, particularly because today has been crazy, and obviously we're headed into a second wave, so it's hard for people to be positive. And I think what you guys just said is important in terms of setting a positive tone, that you believe that the field really has shown their mettle in working with COVID, and that within the field right now, we do have the strength. We've got the bench strength and experience to move forward. And everything from the days where Natalie's talking about the very beginnings to the beginnings of getting out of institutions, the whole idea of today was, yes, we've got a long history. We've been through so many things, and reminding folks of what we've been through, who the people have been that have led us there. And I think when you started, you also, I think it might've been Peg who talked about the leaders that you're seeing up and coming in the field. So you have hope, and you're confident in some of the folks that will be there to take over as some of the elder folks move on and actually retire. And I know some of you are more ready to retire now after COVID than you might have been, but there's another side of it, is making sure.
You know my story. You can't retire till I retire.
Yeah, well, so far we're working on that. But the truth is that's right, Mike. I mean, you know, this generation of, look, when, you know, the founders going back to Tocqueville in the 1800s, people made, you know, they made things better. Every generation of leadership did something that wasn't done before, and that happened. And then, you know, when government money came in, they took the forest thing, they created wide swaths of the path for us to follow. And then the guys that were just, I mentioned Bob Schoenhardt, I mentioned Mike Goldfarb, I mentioned some of these guys that are in the historical project, they widen the path. And, you know, we're not leaving this stage and narrowing the path back again. That's just not going to happen, because the people that in the historical, the people that Peg's working with on the leadership training, the people throughout the state that are working on passing leadership along, we owe them something. So let's get this right on the way out, you know, because I can't keep up with Natalie anymore. I got to, you know.
I
In
agree.
the historic project, we're all excited about the script that those guys are going to write 20 years from now.
And I would like to just end with one piece, and you said it, Mike, about the leaders of tomorrow. Interestingly, last week we were on a Zoom piece on with the leaders, with these individuals that had talked about the folks from our agencies who had spoken with some of the folks from the project and whatever. But what was so interesting was to listen to the enthusiasm and the ideas and where they're going and what they're thinking about and how they want to take charge of certain pieces of what's going on. And they see things now because of where they are differently. They don't have to think about a lot of what we've thought about in terms of how do we get people out, how do we grow. They need to really, they know what they're looking at is how do they make this system better so that folks can live the lives they want to live. And that really is what makes this all work. And as Ed said, it took us all these years to get here. We needed to be here before we could go forward, but now we're ready. And Peg has really helped to develop leaders that really will be able to do this. And if Natalie doesn't retire soon, I am going to go ahead of her. So she's got to get thinking about this here, you know. Okay, so Natalie, I'm wondering, you know, we all know that writing a song wasn't exactly right for Zoom, and you had told me that. How do we get people to do this, to rehearse? So instead, this is all yours. This is your poem. And I think in the end, it gives us hope. So if we could have that poem come up, Cheryl, so we could.
Absolutely. Hi ho, hi ho. We're kicking off the show. This year, the CP conference is just a big fat no. Greetings, no meetings, no drinks in between, because we're all shut down by COVID-19. Our programs are struggling. It's tragic, not funny. We strive to give service with fast dwindling money. The political world is in giant distress. For more than a century, never saw such a mess. And we can't sing our songs if we're not in the room. Who the hell can rehearse while meeting on Zoom? So this is our glory. So our history of glory will keep us alive with our dynamite story. CP will survive.
Right. As always, Natalie, you know exactly what to say. And
You know, I mean every word of it, and I love doing it.
Unbelievable.
something though. She told me that she couldn't sleep at night till she had that
That's
poem.
right. I said, I can't, I can't, we can't sing songs. It's impossible. I said, but I got to do something. So I got up the next morning. I wrote this. I called Susan. I said, what do you think? And that was it.
That was it. Well, she leaves us with a huge amount of hope, and it's not just hope. It's really
It's
knowing
not,
that we are
we will survive. And
absolutely.
we
Absolutely.
all, everything we've all said today is an indication of just that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Natalie, I can tell you already, your poem is a hit. It's eliciting quite a few responses. They're all praising you.
No, it's made the panel go viral. That's what I like.
Okay, well, at least something woke us up. That's good.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
for folks out there, we thank you. I hope that you know the technical side of this worked. That we this was our first go at this, and I think you know, thanks to everyone, you know, Susan, Ed, Ida, Jean, Peg, and Natalie. I mean, you guys really flying by the seat of your pants. I thought did a really nice job. So thank you all very much for putting up with you know, how unprepared we are here in this office, but they've been working all week.
Work good.
Right. So thank you all very much. Ida Jean, I think what we're going to do now is I think we're going to put up the sponsors once again. Thank everyone and remind them that there is a session this afternoon, as Susan mentioned. It's Crip Camp. It kind of flows from this. It also highlights the history, but it highlights the Netflix film. We will have a really, I think, a good group talking about that as well, and the times. And today really is sort of the history day. Tomorrow we have 2 more sessions at 10:30 and 1. Wednesday, the same thing. We do have a virtual cocktail reception Wednesday evening. And then Thursday.
I'll drink to that.
Yes, indeed. And we want to be very clear that it's a virtual cocktail hour, but really the cocktails are not virtual. The cocktails are real, Natalie. So we're going to drink to that.
Okay.
I'll drink anything.
I know.
And then we end up Thursday afternoon. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you again to everyone who was on the panel today. It was really very helpful. We really appreciate your help. And I think it was very positive. I think folks notes the chat things we're seeing is people did find it hopeful. So I know you had some doubts given all that was going on in the world, but people do appreciate your insights. So thank you all very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, folks.